The road looked almost empty. That was the first thing that made the German officers smile. It was the morning of December 22nd, 1944. Somewhere west of Bastogne, Belgium, snow covered the fields. The freezing wind carried the distant sound of artillery across the Ardennes forest. A German reconnaissance team watched American vehicles moving away instead of forward. Through their binoculars, it seemed obvious. General George S. Patton,
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
the aggressive commander who was famous for attacking without hesitation, was pulling units away at the exact moment Germany had launched its greatest offensive in the West. Around German headquarters, maps were studied again and again. Staff officers pointed to the same roads and reached the same conclusion. Patton had finally made the mistake they had been waiting for. They believed they had caught America's most dangerous general out of position. But battlefields have a cruel habit of hiding the truth. What the Germans believed they were seeing and what was actually happening were two completely different stories. Just 6 days earlier, before dawn on December 16, the German army had shocked the Western Allies by launching the massive Ardennes Offensive, better known today as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, pushed through the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Their goal was bold enough to surprise even many German officers. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model hoped to split the American and British armies, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, they believed the Western Allies might be forced into negotiations. The attack achieved complete surprise. American frontline divisions were overwhelmed. Telephone lines were cut. Headquarters lost contact with entire regiments. Thick fog kept Allied aircraft on the ground. German armored columns rolled through narrow roads that only days earlier had seemed quiet and safe. Villages changed hands within hours. Confusion spread faster than the advancing tanks. To many German commanders, it felt like the powerful German army of 1940 had returned for one final strike. Far to the south, however, General George S. Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army. His headquarters was located near Nancy, France, where his soldiers had spent weeks preparing for an entirely different operation. Patton intended to continue attacking toward the Saar River and push deeper into Germany. Fuel dumps had been prepared. Artillery ammunition had been stockpiled. Engineers had already planned bridge crossings. Every indication suggested the Third Army would continue moving east. When reports of the German offensive reached Patton, the information arrived in pieces. At first, nobody fully understood the scale of the attack. Small units reported heavy fighting. Then, larger formations stopped answering their radios. Soon, intelligence officers realized something extraordinary was happening. This was not another local counterattack. Germany had committed enormous forces to one desperate gamble. At almost the same time, German intelligence officers were studying Patton with equal interest. They knew his reputation well. Since the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and across France after the Normandy breakout, Patton had built an image unlike any other Allied commander. He moved quickly, attacked constantly, and rarely gave his enemy time to recover. German reports often described him as unpredictable but dangerously aggressive. Many respected him. Others hated him. Nearly all agreed on one thing. If Patton committed himself in one direction, changing his entire army would take time. That belief seemed reasonable. After all, the Third Army contained hundreds of thousands of men. Thousands of trucks carried food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment every single day. Hundreds of artillery batteries depended on carefully organized supply routes. Tank battalions required constant maintenance. You cannot simply turn an army around overnight. At least, that was what German planners believed. On December 19, the senior Allied commanders gathered at Verdun. The atmosphere inside the meeting room was tense. Large maps covered the walls. Reports arrived every few minutes. The German offensive was still expanding. Some American units were surrounded, others were retreating under heavy pressure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, needed immediate solutions, not long discussions. Patton listened carefully while the situation was explained. He had not come unprepared. Days earlier, sensing that the German attack might grow larger, he had quietly instructed members of his staff to prepare several emergency plans. Instead of waiting for orders, his operations officers had already studied routes leading north toward the Ardennes. Bridges had been identified, fuel requirements had been calculated, traffic control plans had been drafted. If called upon, the Third Army could change direction far faster than anyone expected. When Eisenhower asked how quickly Patton could attack north to relieve the surrounded American forces near Bastogne, many officers expected a cautious answer. Instead, Patton replied that he could begin within 48 hours. The room reportedly fell silent. Some believed he was being overly optimistic. Others wondered whether such a movement was even possible during winter. But what sounded impossible had actually been prepared in advance. While German intelligence officers confidently marked Patton's expected route toward the Saar, American military police were already preparing entirely different traffic plans. Engineers examined icy roads leading north. Supply officers rerouted thousands of trucks. Mechanics worked through freezing nights to keep tanks running. Orders quietly spread through the Third Army. The greatest change of direction in its history had begun. Yet none of this was immediately visible from the German side. German reconnaissance aircraft struggled because of poor weather. Ground patrols saw only small pieces of the larger picture. They noticed some American units disappearing from one sector. They reported fewer attacks against German positions near the Saar. Radio intercepts suggested reduced activity. Every observation pointed toward the same conclusion. Patton had weakened his own front. Inside Army Group B headquarters, several officers believed the Americans had been forced into confusion. They assumed Patton could not risk moving north without exposing his southern flank. If he attempted such a maneuver, they believed German forces could strike his stretched supply lines or exploit the weakened defenses facing the Saar. The more reports arrived, the more convincing the picture became. You can almost imagine the confidence growing around those map tables. Red and blue markers were shifted across frozen Belgium. Staff officers compared patrol reports with intercepted communications. Everything appeared to fit perfectly. Patton was trapped by his own earlier plans. Germany had forced the famous American general into making the first serious mistake of his campaign. Meanwhile, Patton's headquarters looked nothing like the calm image imagined by German intelligence. Telephones rang constantly. Dispatch riders raced through snow-covered roads carrying sealed orders. Large wall maps were updated every hour. Officers measured marching distances with rulers, while engineers calculated bridge capacities. Fuel officers worried about thousands of gallons of gasoline reaching moving armored columns despite snow and ice. Every delay could cost lives inside Bastogne. The challenge was enormous. Turning individual units was difficult enough. Turning an entire field army during active combat bordered on impossible. Columns of tanks, trucks, ambulances, artillery tractors, supply vehicles, and infantry all had to move across narrow winter roads without blocking one another. Military police stood for hours in freezing intersections, directing endless traffic. Drivers struggled through darkness with only covered headlights to avoid attracting German aircraft whenever the weather cleared. Patton understood that speed alone was not enough. Organization would decide success or failure. Instead of allowing units to move whenever they were ready, detailed schedules assigned roads, departure times, and destinations. Engineers repaired damaged bridges before the leading tanks arrived. Recovery vehicles pulled broken trucks into roadside ditches to keep traffic flowing. Quartermasters established temporary fuel points along the routes. Behind every visible tank moving north stood dozens of unseen specialists, making sure it could keep moving tomorrow. Ironically, this incredible organization created exactly the illusion German intelligence wanted to believe. Because American movements were carefully controlled, they appeared smaller than they actually were. Units traveled in disciplined columns rather than chaotic masses. Many movements occurred at night. Snow and low clouds reduced visibility. German scouts observed only fragments of the relocation. No single reconnaissance team saw the full scale of the operation. As a result, reports reaching German headquarters remained incomplete. One patrol reported American tanks leaving the Saar front. Another observed trucks moving west. A third noticed unusually quiet artillery positions. None connected these scattered observations into one massive operational movement. Instead, each report strengthened the existing belief that Patton had lost the initiative. Beliefs are powerful things in war. Once commanders accept an explanation, every new piece of evidence often seems to support it, even when the truth is moving in the opposite direction. That psychological trap was beginning to close around the German command. By December 21st, the situation inside Bastogne had become desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, supported by elements of the 10th Armored Division and other isolated units, was surrounded from every direction. German artillery pounded the town daily. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were becoming scarce. Snow covered foxholes where exhausted American soldiers waited through freezing nights, never knowing whether the next attack would come before dawn. German commanders believed time was on their side. Every hour the defenders remained surrounded increased the pressure. If Bastogne fell, the road network would finally belong to Germany, allowing armored divisions to continue pushing west. Again, everything depended on one assumption: Patton was still too far away. German officers calculated that even if the Third Army started moving immediately, winter roads, fuel shortages, and the size of the force meant it would take many days before serious American attacks could reach Bastogne. They believed they had enough time to destroy the defenders before Patton could interfere. But calculations based on wrong assumptions rarely survive contact with reality. Late on December 22, advance elements of Patton's army were already approaching their attack positions south of Bastogne. Infantry units marched through knee-deep snow. Sherman tanks waited beneath frozen trees, with engines quietly running to prevent them from freezing solid. Artillery batteries carefully concealed their guns behind hills and forests. Officers checked watches, synchronized maps, and reviewed final objectives. Across the German lines, few commanders realized just how close those American forces had already come. The greatest surprise was no longer the German offensive. It was Patton's response. And before the sun rose again over the frozen Ardennes, thousands of American soldiers would step forward into the snow, ready to prove that the fatal mistake the Germans believed they had discovered had never existed at all. The real test of Patton's gamble was only beginning. The first light of December 23, 1944, revealed a battlefield that looked almost frozen in time. Thick snow covered abandoned vehicles. Smoke drifted across the forests south of Bastogne. The air was bitterly cold, but something had changed overnight. For the first time since the German offensive began, the sky started to clear. Engines echoed through the valleys as American artillery prepared to open fire. German officers still believed Patton was days away. They had no idea that the leading elements of the U.S. Third Army were already in position. At exactly the moment many German headquarters expected another quiet morning, hundreds of American guns erupted together. The thunder rolled across the Ardennes, shaking trees and frozen ground alike. Seconds later, infantry units moved forward behind the shellfire, while Sherman tanks crawled through narrow roads lined with snow. The attack surprised many German frontline units. Reports immediately flowed back through field telephones and radios. American armor had appeared where only limited resistance was expected. At first, some commanders assumed these were isolated units sent to probe the line. As more reports arrived, that explanation became impossible. Inside Patton's headquarters, the operation unfolded almost exactly as planned. Every road schedule, every fuel point, and every engineer bridge repair now proved its value. The Third Army had not simply changed direction. It had done so while keeping its combat power intact. Units that had been preparing to attack east only days earlier were now driving north through one of the worst winters of the war. The speed of the movement amazed even experienced Allied officers. German commanders struggled to understand what had happened. They had watched Patton's activity along the Saar decrease. They had seen American units disappear. They had concluded he was weakening his army. Now they discovered the truth. Those missing formations had not been retreating. They had been moving with remarkable discipline toward Bastogne. The evidence they trusted had led them to the wrong conclusion. You can almost feel the shock spreading across the German command posts. Maps were covered with fresh reports. Officers who had confidently predicted Patton's delay suddenly faced an entirely different battlefield. American attacks were growing stronger every hour. The assumption that had shaped so many decisions was collapsing in front of them. The hardest fighting fell upon the soldiers leading Patton's advance. Snow reduced visibility. Thick forests limited the movement of tanks. German machine guns and anti-tank guns were hidden among trees and villages. Every crossroads became a battle. Every small hill could hide another defensive position. The Third Army did not simply drive to Bastogne, it fought for every mile. Among the leading formations was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, one of Patton's trusted commanders. The division pushed relentlessly despite mines, destroyed bridges, and determined German resistance. Tank crews often had to stop while engineers cleared obstacles under enemy fire. Infantry rode on the backs of tanks until machine gun fire forced them to dismount and continue on foot through deep snow. German units fought with determination because they understood what Bastogne meant. The town controlled several key roads crossing the Ardennes. Losing it threatened the entire timetable of the offensive. Every hour Patton gained increased the danger to the German plan. Commanders who had expected to finish destroying the American defenders suddenly found themselves defending against fresh American attacks from the south. At the same time, another change transformed the battlefield. The improving weather allowed Allied aircraft to return. Transport planes dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, medicine, and fuel into Bastogne. Fighter bombers hunted German vehicles moving along crowded roads. The skies that had protected the German offensive during its first days now belonged to the Allies once again. Patton understood that relieving Bastogne required speed above everything else. He constantly urged his commanders to keep moving. Whenever one road became blocked, another was found. When resistance proved too strong, neighboring units searched for weak points instead of wasting precious hours. The pressure never stopped. German commanders expected pauses between attacks. Instead, they faced continuous movement. The German belief that Patton had made a fatal mistake had now become a dangerous burden. Earlier confidence delayed their appreciation of the threat. By the time the true scale of the Third Army's movement became clear, American forces had already gained valuable ground. Time, which the Germans believed belonged to them, was now slipping away. On December 26, after days of bitter fighting, one of the most important moments of the Battle of the Bulge finally arrived. Near the village of Assenois, tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, broke through the last major German roadblocks. Late that afternoon, the leading Sherman tanks reached the defensive perimeter of Bastogne. The long-awaited link had been achieved. For the exhausted American defenders inside the town, the sight of friendly tanks arriving through the snow was unforgettable. They had endured constant shelling, freezing temperatures, shortages of supplies, and repeated German attacks. Now the siege was broken. The road into Bastogne was open once again. The Relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge. Heavy fighting continued for weeks across the Ardennes. German forces launched repeated counterattacks. Roads remained dangerous. Snow continued to slow movement. Casualties mounted on both sides, yet the strategic picture had changed forever. Germany had lost the opportunity to destroy the isolated American garrison before Patton arrived. Looking back, military historians often focus on Patton's famous promise at Verdun that he could attack within 48 hours. But that promise was only possible because of careful preparation. His staff had quietly developed alternative plans before receiving official orders. Logistics officers organized fuel and ammunition with extraordinary efficiency. Military police controlled thousands of vehicles moving through limited road networks. Engineers repaired crossings under severe winter conditions. Success came from preparation meeting opportunity. The Germans had not underestimated Patton's courage. They had underestimated his planning. That difference changed everything. General Patton himself later received much of the public attention. But he never moved an army alone. Behind every advancing tank stood mechanics working in freezing conditions. Behind every artillery barrage were truck drivers delivering shells over icy roads. Behind every successful attack were radio operators maintaining communications, engineers clearing mines, medics treating the wounded, and thousands of ordinary soldiers carrying out difficult tasks without expecting recognition. The German commanders were experienced professionals. Their conclusion was not foolish. Based on the limited information available, it appeared logical. Large armies simply were not expected to reverse direction so quickly in the middle of winter. Most commanders would have required far more time. Patton's reputation for aggressive movement often overshadowed another important quality. He believed speed began long before the first tank started its engine. It began with preparation. The Battle of the Bulge eventually became Germany's last major offensive in the West. Although fierce fighting continued into January 1945, the German army never fully recovered from the losses suffered in the Ardennes. Tanks, fuel, experienced soldiers, and precious equipment disappeared in numbers that Germany could no longer replace. The offensive that had promised to divide the Allies instead weakened Germany's remaining strength. For the soldiers who survived those freezing weeks, the memories lasted a lifetime. They remembered the endless snow, the shattered forests, the sound of artillery echoing through the valleys, and the uncertainty that came with every mile. Many never knew the decisions being made far behind the front lines. They simply carried out their orders while history unfolded around them. In the end, the Germans did not lose because they believed Patton was dangerous. They lost because they believed they already understood him. They watched American movements, collected intelligence, and built a convincing explanation. But war has a way of punishing certainty. Every report that seemed to confirm Patton's mistake actually concealed his greatest advantage. That is perhaps the most remarkable lesson of this story. A battlefield is not won only by the side with the strongest tanks or the largest army. It is often won by the commander who forces his enemy to believe the wrong story. When German officers looked across the snow-covered Ardennes in December 1944, they thought they were witnessing the moment George S. Patton had finally failed. Instead, they were watching one of the fastest operational turns of the Second World War. The mistake they celebrated never existed. The real mistake was believing that a commander famous for speed had stopped thinking ahead. Long after the guns fell silent, the frozen roads around Bastogne remained as quiet witnesses to that truth. Snow eventually melted. Burned-out vehicles were cleared away. Forests slowly grew back. But the lesson remained. On a battlefield filled with confusion, the most dangerous weapon is not always the tank that appears over the next hill. Sometimes it is the assumption already sitting inside a commander's mind, and in the winter of 1944, that single assumption convinced the Germans they had finally trapped Patton, only to discover that they had walked directly into the plan he had prepared all along.